So now we're going to take a look at conditions where weight is either higher or lower than would be ideal. We'll start off by looking at obesity and just looking at some of the risks of obesity. So it is definitely correlated with the higher risk of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, colon cancer, and a reduced lifespan. There are, of course, some myths about obesity, and I think one of the most prevalent ones that your book talks about is that it's due to a general lack of impulse control or poor eating styles. And so we'll certainly be taking a look at that a little bit and looking at what the risks for obesity are from a biopsychological perspective. So if we look at obesity versus being underweight in blue, obesity in orange, we can see that globally obesity is a greater problem. It's just more prevalent. And as countries become more developed, the balance between underweight and obesity switches, and countries go from having a greater proportion of the population that's underweight to having a greater proportion of the country that's overweight as development happens. And so just the general availability of food, in a sense, is not always good for us. Now, there are certainly genetic factors involved in obesity and development of obesity, and we're going to take a look at twin concordance rates, and we can see that for identical twins the concordance rate is much higher, 0.6 to 0.7 depending on whether they're reared together or apart, but it's much higher than what we see with fraternal twins raised together. So it's the identical twins have a much higher rate than fraternal twins. And again, that is the indication that there is a genetic basis to this, because if there wasn't, then there would be no difference between fraternal twins and identical twins. So just remember that. And in a mouse model, we can see that there has been a gene identified as OB, and so the mouse that has two OB alleles here, so in other words, the alleles associated with obesity, is overweight compared to mice that don't have those alleles. And in mice, again, a mutation on the agouti gene causes obesity. It also, kind of in an unrelated way, causes a yellow coat. Now, this is an interesting study in genetics and what's called epigenetics. So epigenetics is where experiences that an organism lives through, so your life experiences, influence your gene expression. So we all know we have genes and alleles and all that, but there are a large number of genes whose role is really just to turn on or off other genes. And so the mechanism through which these genes are turned on or off is often methylation. And so in epigenetics, there are certain life experiences that cause methylation and lead to genes being turned on or off. And so this is really interesting, because what it means is that the offspring will inherit the version of the gene that's been turned on or off as a result of the life experiences of the parent. So here we have a case where both these mice have a mutation in the agouti gene, but the mother of the mouse on the right received supplements high in methyl groups. The resulting methylation reduced expression of the mutant gene. So here we're seeing that this life experience, the methylation, was able to turn off that mutation, and we can contrast that with the mouse whose mother did not go through that. So genes are certainly very important. We've seen a strong basis of genes providing a vulnerability for a person and an animal to develop obesity. But environment is also important. Sleep has been identified as a factor. So not enough sleep increases Ghrelin, remember ghrelin, your stomach growling, that's associated with hunger and starts a meal, and it reduces leptin, the hormone that's released by fat cells, and that tends to reduce weight gain over the long term as a person gains weight. And so definitely not enough sleep is going to lead to weight gain by acting on both ghrelin and leptin. In addition, babies who grow up with pets are less likely to be obese, and that may be related to gut bacteria. So let's take a look at this issue in this really short video.
A study at the University of Alberta in Canada found that being exposed to pets early in life may reduce the risk of developing allergies and obesity. Researchers found that babies from families with pets, especially dogs, had higher levels of two types of microbes that are known to lower risks of allergies and obesity. The team examined samples of fecal matter collected from 746 infants registered in the Canadian Healthy Infant Longitudinal Development Study, whose mothers enrolled during pregnancy between 2009 and 2012, and found that the bacteria Ruminococcus and Oscillospira was abundant in babies exposed to pet dander. Those two bacteria have been linked to reduced childhood allergies and obesity.
So that's an example of an environmental factor that can influence weight, presumably through gut flora. Other things that seem to influence weight are, just the availability of food and what kinds of foods we are surrounded by and that we might be consuming, especially early in our lives. So let's take a look at the other aspect of weight, and that is metabolism. So yes, perhaps there are things that we can consume or the amounts of food that we might consume that can influence being under or overweight, but our metabolic rate is also an important factor. Refers to just the number of calories that we burn on a given day. And so we can think of this as the basal metabolic rate, and that's the energy required to fuel the brain and the body. The brain is a huge, huge drain for calories for humans because our brain is very, very energy intensive. So let's not discount the fuel needs of the brain. But on average, it's about 1,800 calories per day. And of course, it varies depending on the size of the person. And there are sex differences between men and women as well that correspond to muscle mass. But what we know about BMR is that it can shift depending on age, but also on how much you're eating. And so it can shift when people eat more or less than usual, and this ends up minimizing the amount of weight that you would either gain or lose as you eat more or less. And so we can think of it this way: if you start eating less, your body will try to conserve energy and your metabolism will shift down, and that's going to limit your weight loss. If you start eating more, your body's going to again try to resist that, going to try and maintain homeostasis, and will counteract the additional calories by burning more calories, and so your metabolism will increase. And so those are examples of how BMR shifts depending on how much we're eating. We do know that exercise is a factor because that does seem to influence metabolic rate, and there is research showing that 33% of women who were on a restricted diet who didn't lose weight, it was because they had lower BMRs, lower basal metabolic rates. Also, we know that people tend to put on weight as they age. Look over here, look what happens to our basal metabolic rate as we get older. During childhood, it drops precipitously. And here we're at the age of 20, and we can see that it gradually continues to decline through the lifetime. That is another factor, and we need to sort of adjust how much we eat based on that. There are other factors, so basal metabolic rate plus what's called thermic effect of food. This has to do with that when we first eat a meal, there is this little bump in metabolic rate that's associated with every meal. And that's why some people say that eating small meals throughout the day might be a little better. Then there's also what's called neat and NEPA. This has to do with the energy expenditure that we generate through our activity. And one little factor of this is a person's fidgetiness. So I know that sounds strange, but just how much you fidget. When you sit down, is your foot constantly moving? Do you tend to be a person who moves around a lot, or do you tend to sit very calmly and very still? The person that moves along that more and that fidgets more is going to end up burning more calories during the day as well. So these are all factors. And again, also the amount of muscle mass that a person has is going to be a factor as well. So there are these other factors that influence basal metabolic rate.